Good morning, Spartans. Happy Wednesday, May 10th. Again, I'm out of the building today for another golf match, just a few left to do. I'm coming to you from the coach's locker room just before heading out to a match. You can see the agenda today. We're going to wrap up Jeannie, the isolated child, or the feral child, as the term once was, before you guys head off into reading chapter 4, questions 8 through 12. This section will very much help you understand just why socialization is so important. By now, you should have watched the movie and completed the video guide on the secrets of the wild child and submitted your answers for grading in Schoology. But let's get into it. So we've talked about Isabel, we've talked about Anna. You watched the video about Jeannie. Obviously, these children were abused, they were neglected, they were isolated for a number of years. And again, when we're talking about socialization, we're not talking about groups of people necessarily. We're talking about being around any sort of person. One of the children, Anna, if I'm not mistaken, isolated for the first few years of her life, largely neglected, didn't make it past 10, really wasn't able to make any sort of intellectual gains in comparison to children her age. But Isabel was after some painful years, she was able to, more or less get caught up in the world of, language, reading, comprehension, social skills. She was more or less able to get back on track once she was, more or less saved. But the difference between Anna and Isabel is the presence of another person, right? Isabel had her mother with her. And even though they weren't speaking, even though they weren't communicating verbally, that human interaction is what allowed her to make some gains. Jeannie, okay, locked in her room, never really exposed to other people. You saw the painstaking treatment that she went through as people tried to help her get her caught up, largely unsuccessful. She was able to communicate by sign language, but spoken words were a difficult thing. So there's a couple of things to point out here. One, when we're talking about, the use of language, spoken language, it's more or less agreed upon that if children are not speaking by a certain age, that skill may never be developed. There's a certain window of time for spoken language to be learned, to be developed. And if that window is passed and that foundation isn't there, there is no catching up. There is no recovery from it. It's very similar to a situation with my nephew. My nephew was born with something called microplasia, which is a malformation of the ears. Right? He has one full earlobe. His other earlobe is partially developed. He doesn't have ear canals. But inside of his ears, inside of his head, he has all the bones. He has all of the tissue necessary for operating fully functioning ears. And then the question was, is this kid going to be able to hear? Is he going to be able to hear normally? Or is he going to be deaf, hard of hearing? Right? I mean, with modern medicine and technological advancement, it's been learned that even kids who are born with some difficulties the kind of the biological development of fully formed bodies, in this case it would be his ears, he's going to be fine. With the use of cochlear implants, his the physical components inside the ear are still going to develop normally if they are exposed to sound. If he is exposed to sound, as if his earlobes were fully there and he had ear canals. The same is true for language. If children are growing up and they're talking, why it's so important for children to be exposed to other people. If they're using their vocal cords, if they're using the muscles and the tendons and the components of the mouth and the mouth and the throat, those things will develop. But if they're not, it's very much a use it or lose it type situation, right? So socialization is going to be important from a physiological development, right? If we're meant to communicate verbally. If we're not verbally communicating, if we're not using those traits, those attributes that we have, there's a pretty good chance that they will never develop. Now, Jeannie is a little bit different because, some of these doctors were convinced that Jeannie was of, limited mental capability. Now, we have to take in consideration this is in the 1970s, and I've been in education long enough and I've studied education enough where I know that misdiagnosis and kind of broad stroke labels were put on kids that didn't hit certain numbers or didn't have certain attributes. They were just, labeled, characterized, diagnosed as being special needs. Right. If you think about, the movie Forrest Gump, which obviously is a fictional movie, fictional book, but it's along the same lines. I mean, the kid was a couple of points back and, they wanted to send him to a special school. A lot of this happened previously. I don't know if Jeannie's inability to learn spoken word is as much attributed to her for potential mental deficiencies as much as it is attributed to her being isolated and never being able to, develop those parts of our bodies that, again, separate us from the other animals on the planet. The other component of socialization that is so important for us to understand is that being around other people helps us become who we are. It helps us to, kind of reach that, go back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It helps us reach our full potential that humans have. I mean, if you look at these pictures and if you watch Jeannie in the video, I mean, there was almost this kind of like comatose facial expression that they have. And there's, almost comatose facial expressions in these pictures. Right? It appears they look like they don't know what is going on, that they have no comprehension of the world around them. You're going to read this section, questions 8 through 12. But I mean, if you think about the human characteristics of love or trust, or even something more obvious, self-identity, these children have zero comprehension of that. They have zero understanding of that. I mean, if you were to look in the mirror and identify yourself, boy or girl, Christian or Jew, happy or unhappy, loved or unloved, safe or unsafe, these children have zero comprehension of that. Or if you were to look at yourself and then compare yourself to someone else, who you are, who they are, where you're successful, where you're not successful, where they're successful, where they're not successful, these children don't have that skill. They don't have that ability. They don't have this understanding of the self concept. And that's what you guys are going to read about. What allows us to develop into who we are, fully functioning, achievable human beings, separate from everything else on the planet, is based solely on socialization, being around other people. It's what allows us to have cognizant ability, to be aware of just who we are as a person and how we are different from others. It allows us to have feelings and understanding of those feelings, realization of why those feelings are occurring or how to stop those feelings from happening in the future. It all comes from socialization because it causes a constant reflection, evaluation of what is being transferred from one person to the next. And that's what you guys are going to read about for Friday. And I'm looking forward to having a lively conversation as we kind of wrap this all up together this week. So you should have already submitted the video guide for Secrets of the Wild Child. You have questions 8 through 12 for today. And I will see you guys on Friday. Go Spartans.